So globalization is generally seen to have emerged as a historical phenomenon through the extension of, for example, trading, contact. So the origins of global economy could be traced in that sense even to Babylonian and Roman empires. This Musir is in Kerala, or some of the archaeological finds in Kerala which talk about these connectivities even to the Roman and Babylonian empires, stretching all the way to Egypt. So it's long distance trade, right? In that sense. So in a religious sense, in the sense of long distance commerce, the idea of globalization in certain ways has been there. Then there are these historical perspectives that add more substance to such thoughts, like the ones by, have you heard about this historian called Fernand Braudel? Fernand Braudel, Braudel. Have you heard of this historian called Fernand Braudel? Braudel talks about the idea called long durée, which is long durations in phenomena which needs to be followed, and also the theoretician called Immanuel Wallerstein or Andre Gunther Frank. Wallerstein and Frank, in their ways, see the whole thing, the historical globalization, as consequence of the emergence of capitalism, with the contemporary form of globalization, as we see it, simply representing a continuation of the long-run capitalist world economy with social, political, or cultural institutions to go alongside. But few of these studies, most of them don't point to the fact that human species itself became globalized at a much earlier. Because in certain ways, if you are a geologist, not geologist, if you are a archaeological anthropologist, you need to see globalization in a completely different frame. You can't see it as a sociologist, you can't see it as a political science or political economy person. Because for them, people got globalized 1 lakh years ago when they started moving from Africa to different parts of the world, or 60,000 to 40,000 to 60,000 years ago they moved to Australia. So that is also globalization, right? Humans spreading out, they tend to become and that is also a kind of historical globalization. And when humans spread out, they also tended to become cut off from each other, because they become differentiated by language, they become differentiated by customs, technology, the way they look. So these kinds of differentiations that came after the initial spreading out 1 lakh years back, they got more reconnected after the Middle Age voyaging, global voyaging, development of technology. Those resulted in a coming together, long range voyaging, etc. So you probably learned about these ship voyaging, in the sense of Christopher Columbus or Bartholomew Dias, people who were in the 16th century navigating the globe, Magellan. So scientific developments and voyagings resulted in a kind of a globalization. The spread of religion was another way of motivation. Trade and commerce were very important. And so historically, you can see these kinds of tendencies of globalization for a long time. The kind of historical checklist of the key developments in certain phases can be, in certain ways, very illuminative as well. Now, let's take a break from there and go to the more contemporary history, starting from Great Depression, right? First World War and the Great Depression. So despite the shocks of the First World War and the Great Depression in 1930s, nation-state-based global system with the colonial systems of the major powers essentially intact, lasted until the aftermath of Second World War. The Allied victory over Germany or Japan, or the kind of peace arrangements that followed, including Bretton Woods, about which again we'll be talking a lot about, the North Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and economic rehabilitation and integration of the powers, the Axis powers, all of them created a historically unprecedented situation among capitalist countries. So this was for the first time in their history as modern state that it became unthinkable. It became unthinkable that any of them could advance their national interests by going to war with. It becomes unthinkable because after the war, it becomes like you need a peaceful capitalist, what some people might call OIKUMEN in oikumene. Oikumene is a coming together as a family. Economy, economy used to be the subject of managing the family affairs. So a peaceful capitalist oikumene was thus established. Apparently, international relations, we get a rise of liberalism once again and things like that. Right? Woodrow Wilson. So the removal of military rivalries among the major capitalist powers eroded one of the main historical supports of state-level nationalism, that is military rivalry between states. The Cold War tension between Western and Eastern blocs substituted in some ways for this effect, but it did not reach the level of relations among individual capitalist nations, and at any rate collapsed in the late 1980s, because there was a kind of a globalization before, which was thought to be one of the biggest phases of globalization in the 1870s towards the First World War. That never came. The Bretton Woods International Economic Accords among the principal capitalist states, they worked out before the end of the war, established an economic framework for what? Integrating the political and economic system. This maintains nation state as primary unit of economic organization and also primary unit of currency regulation, and it made possible a rapid expansion of international trade. So Bretton Woods was offering another phase. The major purpose of these accords was to, as you would know from your early discussions, to control international trade, especially financial and exchange transactions, and also to protect the ability of nations to implement potentially inflationary domestic policies designed to promote social peace. So Bretton Woods had that scheme even of implementing an inflationary domestic policy to design or promote social peace. How is an inflationary policy sometimes implemented to maintain peace? For example, this is done by providing good salary. Keynesian theory. You have to give people money, but and then there is more money in circulation. There could be a kind of inflation, but that is sometimes needed to maintain social peace. Now, following the war, the US government, with broad support from private capital, they continue to follow 4 broad social economic policies, which they initiate in the previous interwar period. They follow some broad policies. Firstly, to continue to foster the shift of production from heavy capital goods to consumer commodities. Capitalist goods il ninnu consumers using the commodities like a shift kandu thodangi. 1920s onwards, that shift happened. Secondly, to guarantee the rights of labor to organize and engage in collective bargaining, and that's Keynesianism, right? And to provide public assistance to unemployed working class and lower income groups of the population. That is, it's a class compromise. It's a kind of a welfare compromise that the US could think about. Thirdly, to promote high wage contracts for labor designed to increase the purchasing power of workers. Workers need purchasing power, so you need to promote high wage contracts. So they could raise their standards of living to certain kinds of way. European countries instituted policies designed to achieve many of the same purposes, but relying more on welfare state. US had a New Deal kind of a thing. Europe had welfare state. And finally, the Cold War, as it developed after the 1950s, provided a context for a fifth major policy that was to shape political economic reality of USA as well as other major capitalist countries. This was the reinitiation or a restart of massive armaments production. Massive armaments production started, and the development of what is called Keynes marries the army. So, or it's military Keynesianism in that kind of a way. From the end of the war to 1970, these policies largely achieved an objective of promoting social mobility, increased equality, etc. And then what happens? The optimistic class compromise policy of post-war got sustained for a long time, as we already saw in 50s and 60s. There was a boom. The boom was partly, economic boom was partly created by heavy state social payments. Another major cost of post-war boom in the US economy was the continued massive infusions of public funds required by military Keynesianism. You know, the other things like the OPEC precipitated energy crisis and all these kinds of things that happened afterwards. Now, what happens is that, because of the kind of increasing burden which came with the cartels, and also which came with war spending, and which came with increased oil usage, etc. Already by 1970s, a new phase of globalization was coming up. The US had begun running a trade deficit that exaggerates economic tension. The value of dollar could no longer be sustained unless European and Japanese support is there. So it is very difficult. So Bretton Woods system had blow. And as we know, OPEC produced energy crisis in 1973 was a heavy economic blow. US Federal Reserve and Central Bank of other major capitalist countries becomes unable to prevent destabilization. Bretton Woods system of regulation and international financial capital by government, central banks, and nation states, which had been designed to prevent unrestricted movement of global financial capital that could put pressure on national expenditures, effectively collapses. So restrictions collapse. Now, globalization in the contemporary sense, as we know it, comes to roost. Globalization in the contemporary sense of transnational system of trade and financial transactions, in which nation state is no longer the primary organizational framework of economy, has arrived. Globalization constitutes an essentially unregulated intensification of capitalism, capitalist competition, capitalist accumulation, exploitation, and class conflict. In that sense, it is the result of an action and policy of political and corporate leaders, rather than the spontaneous or natural result of just technology and information. It's not just about technology and information. Some people used to think that, it's about new technology, computers, and, information exchange that resulted in globalization. No, it does, however, have one unavoidable economic result. Transnational financial transactions require exchange rates of the national currencies involved to be kept stable. In order to have transnational financial transactions, you have to have an exchange rate that is kept stable. How do you do it? How can you keep the exchange rate stable? The only way is that inflation should be avoided. If you avoid inflation, what sometimes you don't spend on workers. This means that states are under pressure to curtail social policies, constituting the post-war social contract, such as Keynesian contracts like full employment, social transfer of payments, social security. All of this comes to an end with the policies of disinflation. Now, do the states continue to exist at all after globalization of this kind? That's for us to think about. The development of the global capitalist system over the past how many decades?